All right. Well, welcome to our distilled discussion on Stephen King's It. We'll be joined with multiple interns from Rutgers University momentarily, but what I'll do here is, I guess I don't have access to my notes on my phone. I thought I did. I couldn't put two and two together. So no worries. Let's kind of peel back some of the layers and cover some topics in psychiatry that are germane through case discussion of it. For this particular discussion, I know that we've already talked about this film, primarily the 2017 film, which is loyal to the novel, through a case discussion of Pennywise, of it. So let's abandon that. That's done. We had our discussion yesterday during our psychiatry resident didactic red room. For today's purposes, I would like to instead focus on the, quote, Losers Club, end quote. Now, I know that in 2017, we see these characters depicted as children. And what we'll do is we'll kind of identify behaviors that we think should be the topic of discussion, and then we'll cheat. I'll kind of add to the discussion, having not only seen the 2019 sequel at Chapter 2, but also draw from the novel, all right? And see what we can come up with and kind of connect those dots, all right? So for those of you who don't know, the novel, It, is really published in two parts. The first part being the trials and tribulations of these 7 children in 1955 that come across this interdimensional predator. And then after doing what they do, the first part of the novel ends in the ritual of Chud. Defeat it, make a blood pact, and then the second part of that same novel picks up 27 years later, these adult losers, now honoring their blood pact. All right, so with that as our backdrop, is there a character in the Losers Club where you would like to start?
I have one of the kids in mind, but it's not one from the Losers Club. It's the Bowers, I think.
Yeah.
The one who's like terrorizing them. He has like a conduct disorder flavor to him. I mean, also a PTSD because of you see his father, and there's clearly some physical abuse going on. So he definitely strikes me as a character who's like deeply disturbed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he fits the diagnosis. I mean, if he came to clinical attention, I don't think any of us would be in disagreement with his likely having left a psychiatric evaluation with diagnoses of conduct disorder as well as oppositional defiant disorder, right? And maybe even ADHD. We might actually see that triad. Any evidence of bedwetting?
I don't think in the movie.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything in the book about.
I'd be reaching back. It's been 3 or so years since I've read the novel, but I don't know. I do know that several of the other children, and I think even Rich Tozier in particular, there were some nightmares that resulted in his wetting the bed. I don't know if the same is true for Henry Bowers.
And I guess in the movie he exhibits like violent behavior before his interaction with Pennywise. Like he's carving his name into I forget the name of the kid. Yeah, but he doesn't become really homicidal per se until after his interaction with Pennywise, probably.
Right.
Where Pennywise says, "You have to go kill these kids."
Mm-hmm.
And
in some of those interactions too, there's Pennywise, and of course taking different shapes of characters in a commercial. So Bowers is likely to present to clinical attention with a chief complaint of the televisionist talking to me. And right. That would certainly conjure a concern for psychosis, specifically an idea of reference.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Right. And so the idea of reference is a two-part phenomenon. It's when an individual experiences I think a reality-based auditory or visual process, nobody in that room would argue that the television is on. I mean, it clearly is. But the individual that imparts a delusional quality to that process, anybody in that room would tell us that the television was not talking to Bowers. So the delusion here might lend to the suggestion that Bowers is afflicted with early onset psychosis, and then we'd have to go into a differential about what that might be. And just to kind of close the loop on this, the reason why I brought up bedwetting was what is often referred to as the psychopathic triad, right? So cruelty to animals, destruction of property, and bedwetting. Bedwetting is a very loose litmus test for significant family discord, an unsafe home environment. So the psychopathic triad. But I really don't recall, to be honest with you.
I think he does exhibit cruelty towards animals also when he tries to shoot the cat.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's going to be diagnosed with conduct. But and we do see the etiology of this as well. All right, so and what's interesting about Bowers, again, we'll keep it fictional so we can use the word interesting. Where's mom? Right. So what Stephen King depicts, and I really can't speak for Stephen King in terms of what research he did, but it's very consistent with the home environment of usually Caucasian males who turn out to be serial killers. Right? So dad is abusive, alcoholic, mom is absent, distant, and perhaps a prostitute. That is very consistent when you look at the forensic genealogy of and developmental history of people like Manson, etc. My gut says is that Stephen King knew this. This is pretty straightforward. So the fact that he did not write mom into this script is not surprising.
Yeah.
Right? Michael Hare published a wonderful book, Most Evil. I might be getting the title wrong. It was adapted to a short series, maybe Netflix, maybe not. But certainly one of the forensic series that was done very well. He uses his own rating scale on a scale of 1 to 22 in terms of severity of psychopathy. And I never fully understood the scale, why he chose those numbers and how they were actually broken down. I didn't see a lot of validity in the scale. Nonetheless, it was a terrific book read. It really was. And it chapter after chapter, serial killer after serial killer, it's that same home environment. Dad is physically abusive, alcoholic. Mom is absent, distant, victimized by dad, when home, often not at home, and element of prostitution as well. Which, of course, if dad then is incarcerated or otherwise absent, mom's clientele, also abusive to people like Charles Manson, who, by the way, and this is controversial, I believe it was in the book, but I've also seen reports that did not confirm this, but the rumors are, we'll keep it as a rumor, hearsay, Charles Manson's mother actually sold him for a six-pack of beer when he was like 2 or 3 years old,
Wow.
which was one of the first times he went into foster care. So, again, very consistent history there. All right. Nonetheless, moving on from any of the other 7 you want to talk about.
When you mentioned single-parent households, it's kind of a theme in the movie, I guess, because Bev just has her father, and Eddie just has his mother. There's no father figure in his house. So I guess it's kind of a theme with the kids in that movie that several of them have single-parent households. And again, abuse is also a theme. We see Bev and her father. It's never explicitly stated, but heavily implied that there's some sexual or physical or both abuse.
I think it's even more implied or greater implied in the novel as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any doubt about it. And depending on the abuse is clearly ongoing. So acute stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder, I think is fairly straightforward. it would have been interesting if Stephen King developed this character a little bit more to show some unfortunate yet natural progression, because despite what happens during this summer, she has no social support prior to meeting these six friends. So it would be reasonable to assume, certainly in any psychiatric evaluation, the clinician would inquire the extent to which maladaptive coping skills were in play. Do we see her cut? And is there any other evidence that she's developing character traits that are consistent with borderline personality?
Yeah, I guess probably wouldn't count the blood pact at the end. That's the only time you see anybody cut themselves.
No, but actually the blood pact at the end, in the context of this very conversation, is probably something we should briefly discuss, because I think there's a clinical pearl to be had here, and that is not all self-inflicted behavior is suicidal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you'll hear different terms tossed around: non-suicidal, self-harm, etc., parasuicidal behavior. When somebody comes in having cut their wrist or cut their hand, safety first. We have to inquire whether this was due to a suicide attempt. But when the answer is no, there's a differential that I think we have to work through. And, I want to look at the blood pact here as a metaphor, as all those other etiologies that as clinicians we should consider once we have established safety.
Yeah.
If this were consistent with her post-traumatic stress, any idea of what Bev may tell us in itself a safe, hopefully, therapeutic environment?
You mean if the cutting was consistent with her post-traumatic stress? Or,
right.
What she would tell us?
How would she describe?
How would she describe how she feels doing it? I think, sometimes people say, it makes them, it kind of takes their mind off of whatever they're perseverating on, like their trauma, gives them something else to experience.
Exactly right, yeah. So, and what happens if you want to put neurobiology to this, individuals who have experienced this level of trauma will have their hypothalamic fear response resulting in fight, flight, or freeze. Individuals who freeze, aka dissociate, are at risk for developing a future mental disorder within the anxiety and dissociative disorder spectrum. Right, PTSD versus dissociative disorder, the most severe of which could even be DID, depending on the level of dissociation at the time of the trauma. That might be life-preserving, right? I mean, fight, flight, but if neither, then shielding one from the conscious awareness of dad doing this. Unfortunately, weeks to months, years to decades later, that life preservation can actually become maladaptive. It can actually be the focus of clinical attention, and it could be the hallmark of a future mental disorder within the PTSD spectrum, including the dissociative disorders.
Or maybe it's bringing to mind suppression versus repression.
Yeah.
As a defense mechanism. I guess you could talk more about that by the fact about, this is getting into chapter 2, I guess, but the fact that none of them remember what actually happened to them.
Exactly right.
Yeah, but I don't know if we want to go into chapter 2.
Oh, we will.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Why not?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and it's also interesting that she, in chapter 2, marries somebody who essentially treats her similarly to the way her father treated her. We see physical abuse. We don't know if there's any sexual abuse, but that you see that pattern kind of develop.
And from the novel, Stephen King does a very eerie job, very good job, of giving us the visual of an adult Beverly. It's not Marcia anymore, and I don't recall her marriage name, with a visual of her with her husband, but the audio is of her father's voice. Yes, she's married her abuser. She's married her dad, and certainly is getting out of that marriage and getting back to Derry and getting back to her friends, the only people that have ever truly loved her. It was a big part of the development of an adult Beverly. Yep.
I think her relationships with both of them are also very dependent. Like she was stuck in this relationship with her father because she was a kid and she needed, where else is she going to go? And then with her husband, I guess they kind of say he has this company and he's making all this money, and if she leaves, she's going to have nothing, so she's just kind of stuck with him, financially dependent. So it's kind of like a thing with her that she becomes dependent on these abusive figures.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we should address is all of these years in between, because any person that maybe works outside of psychiatry, any person that even works outside of emergency medicine might think, what is she doing? Why doesn't she just leave him? And to your point, this type of behavior is incredibly complex. And it goes well beyond simply becoming dependent and not wanting to go through or go through the this. Always ask if the home environment is safe. Always provide resources, but also be prepared with regard to the stages of change when a person tells you that they don't want help. Right? That's something that we have to keep in mind. Again, just closing the proverbial book on Beverly. Her cutting behavior. Now I know it's the ritual of Chud, and I know why she truly does this blood pact. But as a metaphor, she might tell us that these feelings of dissociation, these feelings of numbing that she's having, are overcome when she cuts. That the pain grounds her. Right. So that's something that we would inquire about. Of course, if we did, we are very likely to be told no. The reason why I cut, honestly, is because I wanted to make a blood pact with my best friends. Now, we know that isn't a differential, but it serves as a terrific metaphor for non-suicidal, self-inflicted harm. Anything else with Beverly?
I think she also, it seemed like she smoked to, what's the word I'm looking for? Cope with her trauma also, and she's still smoking in chapter 2, so it's like, and you see that she's stressed out, she lights a cigarette, so she still has that kind of maladaptive coping mechanism.
That's a good pickup.
Something else that I noticed, yeah.
Yep, and again, I think your observation leads to yet another teaching point in psychiatry, and that is, while we always look at behavior and therefore always look at maladaptive behavior through a biopsychosocial perspective, and we should, another perspective is to look at what might predispose to, precipitate, and even perpetuate an identified behavior. So, number one, I don't know what predisposed Bev to tobacco use, but the abuse itself, that is the physical abuse and sexual abuse, likely precipitated the behavior. And then there's probably biological mechanisms that then perpetuate it, like anyone who's smoking a pack or 2 packs of cigarettes a day can tell us, right? So again, biopsychosocial definitely, but also what predisposes, precipitates, and perpetuates an identified behavior. And you could build a 3x3 rubric to actually understand why a person is doing what they're doing. In this case, why might Beverly be smoking? Because nicotine dependence or tobacco use disorder would appear on Axis 1. It would appear in the medical record upon a psychiatric evaluation. It is considered to be a mental disorder, specifically a substance use disorder, right? Tobacco use disorder. You mentioned Eddie.
Yeah. Eddie, I guess we talked a little bit about him before as far as like factitious disorder by proxy. I thought it was interesting though that in chapter 2 he still had his inhaler, right? Even though he was told it was a placebo when he was a child and that it had no medical effect. And all of his medications his mother was forcing him to take had no medical effect, but he's still preoccupied with this feeling of always being ill and always needing medical attention, even after he's told that. It's just kind of interesting that continued into adulthood.
Interesting choice of words, preoccupied,
Mm-hmm.
because that word appears twice in the DSM.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two syndromes which can be deemed preoccupation syndromes. Any guess as to what they are?
Is that somatic preoccupation? Or
Yep, and this went under a name change back in 2013 to the DSM-5 to illness anxiety disorder,
oh, right, yeah.
which is exactly what he has.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not as a child, perhaps, but definitely as an adult. And I think lends explanation to why he still has an inhaler when it's a placebo. And
Yeah.
I don't even know how he gets that.
Exactly, and yeah, that's a good point. Like, who's
What doctor's prescribing that?
I guess when he was a child, it was the pharmacist who was in on it, or
Yeah.
okay.
As that wonderful little assistant
Yeah.
let him know.
Yeah.
Any guess as to what the other mental disorder published in the DSM-5 is that uses the word preoccupation? And the hint is that it would be something we would ask Beverly. So Beverly, we're thinking a post-traumatic stress borderline spectrum. What's another part of that spectrum? DID is true because if the abuse was severe enough where she actually had an altered state of consciousness during the abuse, DID would be something that she could develop. So it's part of the spectrum, but so is an eating disorder.
Yeah.
And anorexia nervosa is defined through a preoccupation with eating. Or I should say, let me take that back. It's a preoccupation with gaining weight despite being underweight. Right. So the preoccupation of being overweight despite being underweight is the defining criterion of anorexia. Now, if we went to, not so much chapter 1, but if we rewatched chapter 2, might there be evidence of an eating disorder if we were looking for it? Right?
Yeah, I'm thinking about when they're all in the restaurant. I guess we don't see exactly who's eating what. Yeah.
Does she leave the room at all? Any evidence of
Like purging?
Yeah, of course.
I'm not sure if she leaves.
Yeah.
But that would be interesting. It would be something to inquire about it.
If you want to nerd out, rewatch the movie just to look for that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Look
So
for the calluses on the back of the knuckles. Yeah.
Right. It's a Russell sign.
Right.
Now, again, a major teaching point here, because this comes up on board exams all the time. Binge eating and purging behavior does not at all differentiate between anorexia versus bulimia. So many people.
BMI, right?
Exactly
Somebody
right.
who's underweight is anorexia.
That's it.
Yeah.
Right. So a person that in the first sentence of your clinical vignette presents with binge eating and purging behavior, choice A, anorexia, choice B, bulimia are still in play.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Don't get fooled. An individual who has a fear of gaining weight despite being underweight will have choice A, anorexia, be the single best answer. That fear is absent. It is not true of bulimia, and therefore people who have bulimia are very, very rarely underweight. They're usually normal weight or even overweight.
So there's no fear of gaining weight. It's more of a compulsory behavior.
Right, compensatory.
Yeah.
It's compensatory behavior because the one thing that these two eating disorders do share is a distorted body image, or an overvaluation of body image in terms of one's self-image. That is true for both conditions, and as a compensation to that, individuals with bulimia will binge and purge. So it's compensatory. Now, if it's not compensatory, if they're just doing it and there's no compensation, that is, there's no distortion of body image, then there's a third eating disorder called binge eating and purging disorder, and that's where we end up.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the way the algorithm works. Any other observations for Eddie? So a mom is creating an illness in him. Why?
Yeah.
What's her end game? We call it in psychiatry and psychology. We call this gain. What's her gain?
So in her case, it's primary gain. Like it seems like she wants him in the house as much as possible. She wants his attention. She doesn't like it when he goes and hangs out with his friends, or So I guess from that standpoint, it's more like interpersonal, her primary game.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's clear. I don't know if we have enough information in just having watched this film or even having read the book. Again, I read the book a few years ago, so I don't really recall. But if there was an external gain, if there was something tangible that she was getting from this, this would not be fictitious, imposed by another. This would not be fictitious by proxy. There's no name for this. We don't call it malingering by proxy.
Right.
Now, that might be a legal thing, maybe, but it's certainly not a mental disorder.
Yeah.
Anything else with Eddie?
I can think of.
How comfortable are you in your rendering your medical opinion that Beverly is demonstrating post-traumatic stress or even a PTSD borderline spectrum? Anything?
Well, so we don't see her have flashbacks, I don't think, to previous abuse. There's no, I don't think there's any flashbacks in the movie, right?
That's my knowledge.
Okay, we don't see her having nightmares.
Any clustering of depressive symptoms, any impaired concentration, any sleep disturbance, any irritability, any anhedonia?
I don't think we see sleep disturbance. Loss of interest, maybe. I guess at the beginning she's not very interested in hanging out with the other members of the Losers Club. I guess that's something that develops more later in the movie.
And that could be normal.
Yeah, that's normal.
She wants to hang around with these 6 kids.
A bunch of strangers.
Right?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I feel like we don't get a great look at her baseline in this movie. Or I'm not sure about the book. But,
so we'll leave this as a level 2 opinion. I don't think anyone would dismiss that given what she's endured, she may have aspects of acute stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder, despite the fact that we really don't have the symptoms well written into the script. So you brought up nightmares and flashbacks. We have to remember that there is much more to this illness than just nightmares and flashbacks. So we see depressive cluster. We see, as I mentioned, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, irritability, and anhedonia. These are certainly at least 3 diagnostic criteria for depression that are also criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD also overlaps with cardinal traits of other anxiety disorders. So intrusive thoughts that might be misinterpreted as obsessions, therefore OCD quality, and even physiologic reactivity, which may be misinterpreted as panic-like symptoms, therefore a panic attack. Anything there?
I'm thinking about like hypervigilance in particular, and she does seem to be very hypervigilant around her father. Not necessarily around the other members of the Losers Club or other adults, but definitely around her father.
And that's another aspect of this too, because for the clinician that might not ask the correct questions here, the hypervigilance may itself be misinterpreted as paranoia, and the intrusive thoughts may be misinterpreted as voices, depending on how severe they are. So it might be very easy to misinterpret all of the above as a psychotic disorder, perhaps even schizophrenia, right? The person's with voices and apparent paranoid delusions. But especially for people with trauma history, you got to be very careful because the clinician is reminded that these psychotic-like symptoms are defining of PTSD, right? It's not true paranoia, it's hypervigilance. It's not true auditory hallucinations, they're intrusive thoughts. And those are the defining criteria. They are DSM criteria for PTSD. All right. So, and then you could also see that when you combine them with that cluster of depressive symptoms, maybe schizoaffective could be an easy misdiagnosis.
Definitely,
Stanley. What's going on with Stanley?
Remind me which one he is. I'm not great with their names.
Stanley is the friend that doesn't make it into chapter 2.
He almost strikes me as like generalized anxiety disorder because he seems to be nervous about everything in every setting, not just surrounding Pennywise, but he's nervous about his bar mitzvah, right, that was coming up. He's nervous about hanging out with the other kids in the Losers Club sometimes. He just has this general anxiety flare to him.
He does. Yep. So I think when you read again, especially in the novel, he's clearly obsessive compulsive personality.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of his anxiety is the result of things not being perfect.
Yeah.
Contamination fears. And I actually saved it to my notes page. Unfortunately, as we're live streaming, I can't look it up, or if I could, I don't know how to. But there are several quotes in the book that are almost pulled directly from the DSM in describing OCPD. So this is the perfectionist. This is the person who has significant anxiety when they are not in control or believe they have lost control. The person that follows rules to a T is very rigid, has difficulty, making that illegal write unread at 3 a.m. in the morning when there's nobody around. Not that that's right. That's Stanley. And because of that, he's very well grounded in It Chapter 1 to the point where a lot of the experiences are processed, make it into the hypothalamus. That way, in It Chapter 2, he has full recall of what happened to him back in the 1950s, which is why he commits suicide. He knows exactly what he's going back to. So OCPD, and certainly suicidality, as revealed, spoiler alert, in Chapter 2 for Stanley. And again, I would say this is a level 1. It is that straightforward, albeit in the novel. Any other characters we should discuss here? And here we'll expand it beyond the actual 7, if you wanted to.
I think abusive adult figures are pretty... It's a pretty heavy theme in the movie. Even the pharmacist is kind of depicted as being a very sexually forward with Beverly. It's kind of a theme in the movie.
And that's vintage Stephen King.
Yeah.
This is the juxtaposition of childhood innocence with the adults in the room. Very few towns in very few Stephen King movies or settings are good.
Yeah.
Right. It's pretty pervasive that adults carry with them the harm of the world.
I think it's also just in general, the adults in that town seem to be turning a blind eye to what's going on periodically, I guess every 27 years. Just kids are disappearing, some adults are disappearing, and it's just they're just choosing to ignore it.
Yeah.
Which I guess could lead to feelings of abandonment.
Again, vintage Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
We see this in Salem's Lot. We see this in Misery. Nobody would even look for Paul Sheldon if his editor doesn't call from New York and get the sheriff's attention. So very common theme that there's this idyllic setting, but below the surface, and for Derry, quite literally below the surface, lurks this ancient evil that nobody seems to care about, especially the adults. And it's the children that have got to actually take charge and defeat the evil. So, again, pretty common, pervasive theme. Any final thoughts on it, whether it's Chapter 1 or Chapter 2?
I guess, well, we don't want to talk about Pennywise. We already...
We did a good job on Pennywise the other day. For people who want to listen to more of the residents' discussion on what ails Pennywise, we'll have that recording up on YouTube.
I think it's interesting that they, getting to Chapter 2 again, they seem to only want to confront him because they come to the conclusion that if they don't, they're going to die anyway.
Yeah.
So there's almost like an element of coercion here.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think if they were convinced that by moving away, they'd actually be untouchable?
I guess, you have to start talking about feelings of guilt, because they go the rest of their lives knowing that even though they are untouchable, this is still going on. People are dying because they don't want to confront their fears. Feelings of guilt, we start talking again about MDD, making their depression worse. It's a tricky situation. Maybe that's also kind of what led to Stanley deciding that he just was going to take his own life rather than confront this, demon again, because he's like, he didn't see a way out. He said, I could just stay away, but I would be tormented by these feelings of guilt for the rest of my life. Or I could go and confront this figure who, like you said, takes control away from him and just gives him horrible anxiety and fear. So it's like, it was a no-win situation for him in that regard.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
One thing I also would want to add to that in terms of the individual children as adults at Chapter 2 is that they all, with the exception of Mike, move away and become incredibly successul.
Yeah.
Right. As soon as they're out of the shadows of Derry, Maine, and a lot of time, and again, better depicted in the book, but their success is the result of sublimation. That is, they took this experience and they've authored books. Is it Ben? Architect. I mean, builds skyscrapers that are from his repressed memories, right? Noticing that one of the buildings he's planned for and constructed in Europe, happens to be the inside architecture of the library he spent so much time in. So sublimation.
I guess, with Richie, humor is a defense mechanism. He takes that defense mechanism and becomes a comedian.
Yeah.
It's definitely a good example of sublimation.
Mm-hmm. All of them do, with the exception of Mike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mike is the keeper of the pack. He's the de facto town historian, and he's the one that gets everyone back, and that's his role. And unfortunately, he's the only one that is not successful because he does stay in Derry.
Yeah, I'm not sure what his occupation was in Chapter 2.
Was he a librarian? He may have had an occupation beyond.
It seemed like he lived in the library, didn't he?
I think he did.
Yeah, so maybe he worked at the library.
All right, we'll end it there. Everybody have a great weekend. We will be posting